American secrets they didn't teach you in school. We like to think of history as a straight line, a clear story of good guys, bad guys, and progress. We are taught that the government exists to protect the people, and that democracy is sacred. But what if I told you that the history you know is just the surface? That hidden in the archives are moments where the script was almost flipped entirely. Today, we are looking at 3 events that have been conveniently left out of most textbooks. 1. The time Wall Street bankers plotted a fascist coup to overthrow the President of the United States. 2. The decade the federal government intentionally poisoned its own citizens to prove a political point. And 3. The secret plan signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to commit acts of terror on American soil, and blame it on an enemy. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are historical facts, backed by congressional records and declassified files. Welcome to the Secret History of America. Part 1. The Wall Street Putsch, the business plot. Let's start in 1933. The Great Depression is crushing America. People are starving. And a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, has just launched the New Deal, a massive series of programs to help the poor and unemployed. Most of America loved him for it. But on Wall Street, he was a nightmare. Wealthy industrialists saw FDR's policies as the end of American capitalism. They called him a socialist, a class traitor. They were terrified that their fortunes were about to vanish. And so, a group of powerful men decided that democracy was no longer working for them. They needed a plan to get rid of FDR. But they couldn't just assassinate him, that would make him a martyr. They needed a coup, a march on Washington, led by an army of angry veterans who would force Roosevelt to hand over power to a dictator. But to lead an army of veterans, they needed a hero. A soldier the men trusted. Enter Major General Smedley Butler. 2-time Medal of Honor recipient. A legend in the Marine Corps. The most decorated Marine in U.S. history at the time. In the summer of 1933, a bond salesman named Gerald McGuire approached Butler. He claimed to represent a group of wealthy backers with $3 million in cash, which is about $60 million today. They laid out the plan. Butler would raise an army of 500,000 veterans. They would surround the White House. Butler would demand that FDR create a new position, a Secretary of General Affairs, who would run the country while the president became a powerless figurehead. If FDR refused, the army would take over. They picked Butler because they thought he was a soldier's soldier, who would follow orders. They made a massive mistake. Smedley Butler was a patriot. He played along just long enough to get the names of the conspirators, and then, he went to Congress. In 1934, Butler testified before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, the precursor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. He named names. He detailed the funding. He exposed the business plot. You might expect that this led to mass arrests, treason trials, the collapse of Wall Street banks. Nothing happened. The committee confirmed that Butler's story was likely true. They found evidence of the funding. But the names of the wealthy backers were redacted from the final report. No grand jury was called. No one went to jail. The media at the time, heavily influenced by those same business interests, mocked the story as a gigantic hoax. But years later, historians found that the threat was very real. If Butler had been a different kind of man, a man who wanted power, 1933 might have been the year American democracy ended. The Chemists' War. Let's move back a few years to the 1920s. Prohibition. The government had banned the sale of alcohol to improve the moral fabric of the nation. But there was a problem. The ban didn't work. Americans were still drinking. They just bought it from bootleggers who stole industrial alcohol, the stuff used for cleaning supplies and paint, and redistilled it to make it drinkable. By the mid-1920s, the government was frustrated. They couldn't stop the theft of industrial alcohol. So, officials in the Coolidge administration made a decision that sounds unthinkable today. If people wouldn't stop drinking the stolen alcohol, the government would make sure it killed them. This was known as the Chemists' War. The Treasury Department ordered manufacturers to add more deadly poisons to industrial alcohol. They added kerosene, chloroform, and, most dangerously, methyl alcohol. Methyl alcohol isn't like the ethanol in your beer. It metabolizes into formaldehyde in your body. It destroys your optic nerve. It causes blindness, respiratory failure, and death. The government knew exactly what would happen. The idea was deterrence. If enough people got sick or died, the rest would be too scared to drink. Christmas, 1926. The plan went into full effect. In New York City alone, hospitals were flooded. Dozens of people died in a single night, hallucinating and gasping for air. The chief medical examiner of New York, Charles Norris, was horrified. He issued a public statement calling it our national experiment in extermination. He desperately tried to warn the public, releasing guides on how to try to purify the tainted liquor, but the government kept changing the formulas to make them harder to clean. This went on for years. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, it is estimated that at least 10,000 Americans had been killed by this federal poisoning program. Think about that number. 10,000 people. These weren't enemy combatants. They were citizens whose only crime was wanting a drink. And their government decided that the penalty for that crime was death by poisoning. Finally, we arrive in 1962. The height of the Cold War. The U.S. is terrified of a communist Cuba lying just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, wanted a war. They wanted to invade Cuba and remove Fidel Castro. But they had a problem. The American public didn't want a war. And the world would condemn the U.S. if they attacked a small island nation without provocation. So, they sat down and drafted a document called Operation Northwoods. The document, which was classified top secret for decades, proposed a series of false flag operations. These were attacks to be carried out by the U.S. government against U.S. targets, but staged to look like the Cubans did it. Here is what they actually proposed, and I'm quoting the documents here. Hijack civil airliners. They suggested creating a duplicate of a civilian plane, loading it with passengers or empty drones, and shooting it down, blaming Cuban MiGs. Terror campaigns in Miami and Washington, D.C. The Joint Chiefs proposed exploding bombs in American cities, arresting Cuban agents, who would actually be U.S. operatives, and releasing fake documents to prove Cuban involvement. Sinking a boat of refugees. They suggested sinking a boatload of real Cuban refugees on their way to Florida, killing them, and blaming Castro for the tragedy. This wasn't a rogue idea by some low-level agent. This was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was a formal proposal presented to President John F. Kennedy. The goal: to manipulate the American people into demanding kill innocent civilians to justify a political objective. So, why didn't it happen? Because of one man, President Kennedy. When the plan hit his desk, he rejected it. He told General Lemnitzer there was no way the U.S. would resort to acts like that. A few months later, Lemnitzer was removed from his position as chairman. But the terrifying reality remains. The people in charge of the U.S. military were willing to kill American citizens to start a war. And if a different president had been sitting at that desk, Operation Northwoods might have been a reality. The business plot. The Chemist's War. Operation Northwoods. These aren't stories from a dystopian novel. They are parts of our history that are often glazed over because they are uncomfortable. They challenge the idea that authority is always benevolent. Smedley Butler stopped a coup. Public outrage eventually ended Prohibition. JFK stopped Northwoods. In every case, disaster was averted, but often by the slim margin of a single person saying, no. History is filled with secrets like these. The question isn't, did this happen? The question is, what else is buried in the archives that we haven't found yet? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, which of these 3 events shocked you the most? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.